did. You did. In what years?
They're designing the economies for that.
Right.
And I was on the team that was designing that. And then I just worked with them in their new school they call Ecology and Economic Justice. Do you know my colleague from Jamaica?
You're Colin.
Colin.
Colin Cameron.
Yeah.
My buddy. We're from the same part of Jamaica.
Oh, is that right? He's very, he's so we worked together on a couple of teams.
Ah, he's back in Jamaica.
I know he is.
Well, I also know the new General Secretary.
Oh, you do?
Well,
Yes, I do too.
When they started the missions project,
Yes.
he was one of the early persons, young people in it. And I was one of the coordinators in Jamaica.
Oh, is that right?
Right, so this is many moons
So
ago.
you know the Amissius project.
Well, I'm aware of it.
Well, how delightful.
Yeah, as I said, people around here just don't know what that organization is and how
It's
radical it is.
It's an amazing organization.
And you see, when you say mission, people become suspicious.
Of course, with good reason.
But this was overturned by Caribbean people.
Oh, was it the Caribbean people that helped
It- And I know them, who
Yes.
just shifted the whole ethos of it.
I am just mind-boggled
Yes.
by the work that they do. And then the DARE project.
Yes.
I was at the first meeting of the DARE project with Sudipta Singh.
I'm aware of it.
It's quite amazing. It's just really quite amazing. No, Colin is, I've got a large quote from him in my book that I just finished. Yeah.
Oh yes, we grew up in the hills of Jamaica.
Oh, yeah.
2 years old.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I think it is time for us to get started again. I just had the delight of meeting your dean, Reverend Dr. Michael Miller, and found out that we have some very, very close friends and colleagues in that we share, which was just delightful. Yeah. Well, Jesus said, "I have come that they may have life and have it in fullness." We are called to carry on the work of Jesus. This morning, we have been exploring God's call to build fullness of life for all and to love neighbor as self in the midst of a particular form of contemporary empire, economic empire. That is, economic powers and structures, systems structured to concentrate wealth in a few hands, even though it may damage countless people and endanger Earth's livable climate. Earlier this morning, we began a framework for living into that vocation. A framework with 3 building blocks. 1, a shift in perspective to see economic life as spiritual practice. 2, 3 terrains of change. And 3, 10 fingers on the hands of economic healing. So now we carry on by exploring 3 of those 10 fingers on the hands of healing economic life. And then we'll just glimpse the other 7. The one I'd like to explore more with you first is the first one on the list, building the new. So, a vibrant face of the new economy movement in the US and globally is a host of people building and supporting small-scale or regional forms of business, finance, agriculture, and energy. Alternatives that put the well-being of everyday people and the earth over endless profit and growth. These initiatives still attend to the financial bottom line, but that is held along with 2 other bottom lines: human well-being and ecological well-being. It's called a triple bottom line. It's taught much more in Europe than in the US, but it's coming into US business schools also. The triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. So emerging with blazing energy around the world, this movement to build the new is creating the germ cells of an equitable, ecological, and democratic economy. The movement to build the new shows us that a different kind of economy is not just a dream, but is something already under construction. So wait a minute, you may say. I am not going to be building a new business or farm. Well, that's true for most of us, including me. Our role then is to support these alternatives by using them instead of their publicly unaccountable, profit-maximizing mainstream counterparts. Listen in for a moment on a story of one church community that is engaged in building the new at the heart of their ministry. Excuse me. The community is called Grace in Action. It's in Detroit. This story is actually a story that I have a forthcoming book called Building a Moral Economy, and it is the introduction to a series that will follow it of 7 volumes around food for all, water for all, housing for all, etc. So you can have your eyes open for that, but this story I took straight out of that book, which I just sent to the publisher 2 nights ago at about 2 o'clock in the morning. How about that? Yeah. So here's the Grace in Action in Detroit. I was visiting. I'm describing my visit to them. Joy bounced off the walls. Children scampered about. Voices in Spanish and English greeted our ears as we entered the room. Luscious smells of tortillas and onions on a grill filled the air. An elder scooped up a small child and beckoned to us to have a seat in one of the folding chairs. Community art decked the walls. this was a weekly gathering to eat together and simply celebrate the joys and trials of being a community. This neighborhood in southwest Detroit was known in the larger world as a place of poverty and need. Yes, there were needs. Young people needed jobs. Families needed income, food, internet access, rent control, child care, and more. What many outsiders did not see was also the beauty and strength of the people. In this neighborhood, the people built Grace in Action Church and Collectives, a movement of people creatively living out the love of Jesus in ways that were rooted in the needs and gifts of the community. They believe that the gospel of Jesus includes creating a better life for people, especially people in need. Fullness of life. Fullness of life, Grace in Action says, is not only about spirituality and community, but also about economics, end quote. They have put that belief into practice. They have built a network of worker-owned cooperatives and youth-run collectives, as well as a worshiping community. One youth collective designs and develops websites, software, and digital assets for small to mid-sized businesses and nonprofits. Another of the collectives, the Equitable Internet Initiative, makes high-speed community-based internet available to many low-income households in southwest Detroit. These two are joined by 3 other collectives. Life has been transformed. Youth have jobs, invaluable training and leadership skills, and access to higher education. Households have incomes, internet, and collective power. People have trustworthy community and joy. Worship is wed to the everyday lives of people. Oh yes, it has been challenging. Tenacity, deep listening, learning from mistakes, and strong community organizing, and starting over have marked the trail. In the process, they are building the new forms of economy that breed justice and life and belonging. So that's the end of the story. The examples, however, are literally infinite. Look up on your computers the Cleveland model. 3 local employee-owned co-op businesses were developed in previously deprived neighborhoods. They provide goods and services that anchor institutions, that is, hospital systems, you recognize that term, hospital systems and universities make a commitment to use. This creates jobs, good ones, where people have a say in the company's decisions about wages and benefits. The 3 businesses are a commercial laundry, a produce producing company, and an energy company. The Cleveland model is being replicated in many cities around the US and also in Scotland. So that's one finger on the hands of economic healing, building the new. A second finger we've already begun to discuss, and it was brought up by the woman in the back who talked to us about Florida. Change the rules. Change the rules, and it's the 3rd one down here, is the call to change public policy so that it is 1, reducing the gap between rich and poor, 2, supporting ecologically regenerative business and transportation and food and households, and 3, enabling power to be distributed and accountable. Again, you see the 3 guidelines: equitable, ecological, democratic. Again, let me share with you a story. It's a story from one church community engaging in the ministry of changing the rules, public policy. This story also comes from the book. I don't do politics. I want to keep my hands clean of all that. I believe that people of faith should be neutral in divisive political matters and be active in helping people." End quote. Max, the speaker, was a faithful member of a congregation. He had a deep heart of care for people in poverty. His hard work and kind countenance sustained the congregation's food bank. His laugh kept folks going. Someone here at the break told me they think laughter is the key to life. I think Max knew that. Max's "I don't do politics" was responding to my suggestion that, as a part of his Christian practice of neighbor love, he join a campaign to pass a law in Washington state that would benefit very low-income people. After this conversation, we began, over a period of months, to talk further. He attended an intergenerational Bible study on the meaning of love thy neighbor as thyself. I recommend that everyone do a year-long study of love thy neighbor in their congregation. It was an experiment, this Bible study, bringing together confirmation kids and adults to probe the meaning of neighbor love in our world today. In the class, we looked at roles that public policy plays in creating poverty and concentrating wealth. We also explored the role that public policy could play in undoing poverty and undoing the gap between rich and poor. Emily was one of the confirmation kids in the class. At one point, she read the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Do you familiar with that name? Archbishop Desmond Tutu from South Africa. Okay. He said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." End quote. The room after Emily spoke. Emily was actually a quiet girl, and she read his words with real power and strength. The room went quiet. Then an elder, we knew him as Mr. Androwski, asked, "What elephants are standing on the tails of the people who come to our food bank?" I will never forget Max's face. He did not come back to the class the following week. Later we talked. Max said that his world was shattered when he heard Emily read Bishop Tutu's words and Mr. Androwski's question. 4 months later, Max was a leader in the community organizing campaign to pass the law that would benefit poor people. He said this was being a good Samaritan to many impoverished people in the state. "Go, Max," I said to myself. "Go, Holy Spirit," replied my friend Susan when I told her this story. So long ago in my youth, I thought that legislative and electoral advocacy, dimensions of change the rules, did not matter. Laws would never be passed, nor people elected that would really try to make society more just. Regardless of whom we elected, things would go on as they are. Well, later I learned my lesson as I saw the devastation that can be wrought by poor choices of elected officials, and I witnessed the power of laws to change society for the better and the worse. In this sense, public policy advocacy, what we call changing the rules, is a spiritual practice. It is attuning one's heart to perceive why people are suffering, what is causing the suffering, and then stepping in to stem those root causes. Imagine for a moment the life-saving impact that changing the rules through public policy could have in the U.S. I picture the lives that would be saved if good health care benefits were mandated for all people, or for families who are malnourished and live in cars because the parents' full-time work is underpaid. What would it mean to earn a living wage? What if we determined a legal limit on the wage ratio between the highest and the lowest paid people in a company, knowing that now we have companies who compensate some people 700 times what they compensate others? In many ways, public policy advocacy is a crucial element in ministry. Ministry for a more compassionate, equitable, and ecological economy. Whether people will have health care, access to medication and clean water, whether people will be able to feed their families is determined by public policy. Public policy determines whether public banks can exist and worker-owned cooperatives can thrive. One religious leader declared, "It is time to move." I don't agree with his words, "out of." He says, "It is time to move out of the terrain of charity and into the domain of policy. Take an active role in shifting the policies that make charity necessary." I would say it is time to move still in the domain of charity and the domain of policy. And take an active role in shifting the policies that make charity necessary. Yes, changing the rules is a second finger, or the third we have here, on the hands of healing our economic lives. Let's look at one more finger on those hands. Change the story. I recall vividly an Indigenous colleague at the university, Seattle University, where I taught 14 years ago. She said, "If you want a different ethic, tell a different story," end quote. Let me tell you where I'm going. I will suggest that first, the stories undergirding economic life as we know it are dangerous and untrue. And two, that Christian faith includes an infinitely rich story to counter that economic story and help free society from it. First, a brief insight I'd like to share with you into the power of guiding stories to shape life. The background is this. I spent years of my life as a church worker, health worker in Latin America, and then as an educator. I was there during the civil wars in the late 20th century. For centuries, since colonization, many indigenous people in the countryside had been fed a story that they were less worthy than other people, especially less worthy than light-skinned people and people with money. So that's the backdrop to this very brief story. This story actually comes from a book by a woman named Penny Lernoux. A religious sister was traveling from village to village in the mountains of Guatemala. Upon entering a village, and most of these villages are populated by indigenous folks in Guatemala. Upon entering a village, she could tell without exchanging a word whether it had been visited regularly by promotoras de la palabra. That means young people who traveled into the countryside and into distant villages to lead base Christian communities, small Christian communities in the villages. These young people taught villagers to read by reading the Bible. In the villages where these young people had worked extensively, this religious sister noticed people walked differently. They walked with dignity and self-respect. What, she mused, is going on? Why do some of these villages have people walking with dignity and self-respect? Why did they walk this way? It was, she finally realized, because in reading the Bible for the first time, the people had learned and internalized the story of God's preferential option for the poor, Jesus' solidarity with oppressed people, and their infinite dignity and worth. They had learned a different story of who they were. We human beings perceive and act in response to worldviews into which we have been socialized. People in many fields of study speak of these enculturated worldviews as life-informing narratives, stories, or myths. They say, and I think this is true, that human beings create a story, and then we order life to be players in that guiding story. The biologist David Suzuki, for example, writes that the human, I'm quoting him, the human brain creates a narrative. The brain selects and discards information to be used in the narrative, creating a web of meaning. When the mind selects and orders incoming information into meaning, it is telling itself a story, end quote. These guiding narratives become the lens through which we see our world. They explain who we are, what our purpose is, what is right and good, who counts, how we ought organize our lives. They shape how we live. These stories are largely unconscious, and they are passed from generation to generation, carrying assumptions that become conventional wisdom. The danger, of course, is when unexamined narratives, mindsets, assumptions, worldviews undergird perilously destructive ways of life. When we believe destructive stories, not knowing, not being conscious of them. A function of mature adulthood is to become aware of our guiding narratives, assess them, choose which ones to retain or revise or reject. For our purposes here this morning, we're considering the stories or mindsets that govern economic life. Countless voices now argue that the set of narratives, or taken for granted truths, undergirding economic life as we know it, has gotten us into a mess of grotesque wealth inequity and climate catastrophe. These narratives have helped lock us into economic systems that shape diseased relationships with our neighbors. If we're going to write and live into a more life-supporting economic story, we need to understand the dangerous story that is shaping our lives and how it came to have such a hold on us. The economist David Korten says it well. He says, to get our future right, we must get our economics right. To get our economics right, we must get our story right, end quote. Colonialism has shaped the guiding narratives or worldview for people in the US and in many parts of the world. The colonial worldview justified European exploitation of peoples and lands. This worldview holds that some people are less fully human and less entitled to human rights. It assumed that Earth's goods were meant to be commodified and sold for profit by whomever could control them. It includes an unspoken assumption that it is normal or natural for people to maximize profit or material gain, regardless of the cost. A different consciousness might say, no, wait a minute. That should not be normal or acceptable. Our theologies play a huge role in worldview or guiding stories. Now, what I've said does not make me an inheritor of these assumptions, a bad person. Rather, it means that building a moral economy as a face of neighbor love depends upon examining the fundamental mindsets that normalize inequality, and exploitation. Reverend Christopher Carter says it well in relationship to Christian faith. He writes, "As Christians who are directed by the greatest commandment to embody love and pursue just relationships with all of our neighbors, we are all charged with the task of decolonizing our minds, as well as our religious, social, and political institutions." End quote. That means changing the story. This is a call to recognize, assess, and change our mindsets or guiding narratives. What unconscious narratives or assumptions in the US, for example, make it seem normal or acceptable for a company to compensate some people with the equivalent of thousands of dollars per hour while not paying others enough to feed a family? What guiding narrative regarding human worth and human rights shapes that sense of normal? I have to tell you, I was giving a lecture in Norway, and a man stood up and he said, "Dr. Moe-Lobeda, things have gotten so bad in Norway now that the highest paid executives earn 14 times what the lowest paid people earn." I said, "Did you say 14? He said, "Yes, that's outrageous. It's just too big a gap." And I said, "Sir, in my country, it's more like 400 times. But I tell you that because it's a different perception of what's normal and acceptable, but just assumed. Changing the story may also be seen as a matter of inner healing for individuals. To illustrate, imagine the healing of girls and women if we change the story perpetrated by the beauty industry economically to maximize profit that little girls must look sexy and have bodies like Barbie dolls to be really worthy. What healing it would be to change that story. I think when I say that, I think about my little 6-year-old granddaughter and how I don't want her to internalize that story that she sees on the advertising and the billboards all the time of what she needs to be worthy. Yeah. Transforming an economy to economies for life, and again, that's the language used by the Council for World Missions, means recognizing key assumptions that the dominant economic story instills in people today and the consequences of holding on to them. What are some of those key assumptions? I'll name a couple of them. As you hear them, just consider where you see it operative in the world around you, perhaps on subconscious levels. 1, economic growth is inherently good. The greater the growth, the better off we are. 2, the more we buy, the more we are supporting the economy and thus the common good. 3, human freedom includes the right to accumulate as much wealth as possible and do as we wish with our possessions, as long as it's legal. 4, business companies and finance industry should maximize profit. It is their obligation. Next, poverty is largely due to deficiencies in poor people. Next, the earth and its plenitude are primarily here to meet human needs and desires. Finally, white people in general have more natural right to or need for material comforts than have black or brown or indigenous people. Black, brown, and indigenous people are more naturally poor. The tricky thing is that on a conscious level, we may distinctly disbelieve some of those claims. We may work against them, yet they still influence our society and to a certain extent infiltrate our psyches. The myth of white superiority is an example of this. So, these then are 3 fingers on the hands of healing our economic life. Build the new, change the rules, change the story. There are others, and we have noted them, and they're up here in front of us. Let me check my time. Okay. We won't go into them in depth. Let me name what they mean. Live lightly means choices to have lifestyle practices that consume less, exploit less, and produce less greenhouse gases. Move the money is tremendously powerful. It has to do with finance and how we invest and divest. Many would say it's one of the most important fingers on the hands of change regarding issues of climate, moving the money from fossil fuels into renewables. Resisting the wrong, actually, what it seems very real and important to me, let me take a step back, is to see what resources the church brings to these different fingers on the hands of change. I think people of faith bring amazing resources to these fingers. So let me look at them in that sense. For Change the Rules, we have public policy advocacy offices, faith-based, in many states. The church offers those as advocacy resources. Move the money. Faith communities have been at the forefront of efforts to divest in the name of justice and ecology. It was faith communities that took the lead in divesting from South Africa to help change apartheid in South Africa. Faith communities are behind the movement to divest from fossil fuels and invest in renewables. Resist the wrong. Civil protest, demonstrations. The Lutheran bishop in Palestine, Bishop Munib Yunan, when I was listening to him once, he called resist the wrong or civil protest, he calls it evangelical defiance. And I thought that was a beautiful name. Build the bigger we've talked about, and one of the powers of the church there is that we have siblings across the world to collaborate with. Practice awe, gratitude, lament, and holy anger. Think of the resources that the church brings to lament. The whole book of Psalms that were meant to be read as public lament. Emily Towns, the former dean at Vanderbilt, talks about the power of public lament in the book of Joel. And it was social healing came for the people after public lament, crying out to God. Think of how we can weave into liturgy awe and gratitude and lament and holy anger. Listen and amplify. Listen to the voices on the underside of the current economy. Amplify those voices. The church brings Jesus, who listened to the voices on the underside of power and privilege. Change the story. We've been talking about the power of theology to change the story of who human beings are, equally worthy, and to change the story of what the earth is, dwelling place of God, is tremendous. The last one, drink the Spirit's courage. The Hebrew Bible word for Holy Spirit, ruach, could well be translated, I'm quoting Martin Luther, could well be translated as bold, undaunted courage. Faith communities have brought courage to great social movements throughout time. So, as we said at the outset of this part, the connection between these forms of action is crucial. Always be aware that in practicing one, we are opening doors for the others. In closing, In this second presentation this morning, we have explored the third building block in our framework for building a moral economy. It is 10 fingers on the hands of economic healing. That building block works together with the other two building blocks, a shift in perspective to see economic life as a spiritual practice, and 3 terrains of change. The ministerial work of building moral economic lives is a sacred journey, a journey of healing distorted relationships with the earth, with ourselves, with neighbors far and near who are hurt by current economic systems, and healing our relationship with God. You can shift the slide. It is heeding healing our economic lives is heeding our vocation to love neighbor as self in the context of contemporary economic empire. It is honoring God's 2 overarching rules for the people of God. Love your neighbor and serve and preserve the garden. Building a moral economy is central to ministry in an age of economic empire. So I am grateful to you all for exploring this sacred journey with me today. Thank you. I believe there was a person in the back who had a question last time that didn't get asked. Is that right? Good.
Thank you.
Yes.
So we talked about moral injury some this weekend. It's incurred when we participate in practices that damage our neighbors. For example, you talked about buying produce that is harvested unethically, that damages workers. So some of us can afford to pay extra for the ethically sourced produce, but not all of us. So what does it mean that some of us can afford to absolve ourselves of moral injury while our neighbors continue to incur it? I'm just wondering. And if we advocate with our grocers, please only carry the ethical produce, and then our neighbors can't afford any food. It's not to say that the well-being of the exploited workers is less important than the impoverished consumers, but how can they both be fed?
Yes, beautiful question. It's a really, really important question. And moral injury, I think, is a category that describes very, very well what we're talking about. As I think about that, and I've thought about this a lot, I believe that different people have different moral obligations, and we have different moral obligations at different times in our lives. So if I have enough income that I can spend more to buy an electric car rather than buying a used car that uses fossil fuel. Whereas if I did not have sufficient money to do that without sacrificing my kids, without sacrificing my own health, then it would not be my moral obligation. It might not be my moral obligation now, it might be 15 years later. And I think that that's really, really important. And one of the powerful things that feminist theology has brought to this question, I think, of neighbor love is there was a time in theological history in which it was assumed and taught that love your neighbor was the antithesis of love yourself, that they were opposite. You couldn't do both. And you can read all kinds of literature on that. But now feminist theology taught us otherwise. No, it's also vitally important to love, respect, honor self. Women were always taught not to love, honor self. And as I've thought about that and worked with that and valued it, I also, in studying Luther's economic ethics, he called for tremendous love for neighbor, but also serving one's own needs. So that's a really important question. No one can hold oneself up as like more righteous than because I can buy and because I can afford to do. So part of my moral obligation, though, is also to be a part of changing the economy to the extent that it's not going to be more expensive to buy the ethically produced things. And that's the aim, so that it's not only something that one can do as an individual. And that's part of the role of change the rules. So we need public policy that supports local agriculture so that it isn't more expensive. So I hope that responds a little bit. I thank you for the question. It's a really important one. Yeah.
I think we may have time for maybe one more question. If there is anyone who has a question burning in their hearts. Going, gone.
I've retired after 50 years of ministry. And in 50 years of ministry in the local church, the discussion was always how to pay the electric bill.
How to pay the electric bill.
And the mortgage.
Yeah.
And the repairs.
Yeah.
And then occasionally how to pay the preacher. Not humorous in many cases. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Have you been there?
Yeah.
Many of us have.
Yeah.
And your lecture and discussion is wonderful. But in a church that is so centered on these, what they call the essentials,
Yeah.
the electricity bill, the mortgage payment,
Yeah.
even salaries,
Yeah.
how do we move further on to go to this extreme of changing the vision and the focus
Yeah.
to the needs of the larger community?
Yeah.
How would you suggest?
How do we change the vision and the focus to see more the needs of the local community when we can get so wrapped up in just the economics of the finance of the church? My first response is I wish that this wasn't just a lecture, but that we had a few hours so that everyone could put their brains together on that, because it's such an important question. But this isn't a lovely pedagogical moment, it's a lecture, so I won't ask for that. I think, and partly in my experience, that people are moved when they understand themselves called by Jesus and empowered by the Spirit. And I think it would be fascinating to take a in-depth look at loving neighbor and what that means, the integral dimension of loving neighbor, and just what it means in our context, what following Jesus in loving neighbor means, and what doors that would open to people's minds and hearts about serving the greater good. Another dimension in response to your question, I think, is the importance of people sharing the stories and the realities of their own lives. So people in the congregation, our congregations are full of people with economic pain and anxiety and troubles and fears. And we don't often talk in our congregations about those difficult parts of our lives. I co-teach a course called Faith-Based Community Organizing as Spiritual Practice. And one of the things we teach is having one-to-one conversations, a listening campaign in a congregation. And it would be very, very meaningful for congregations to have a listening campaign and listen to one another. Intentional, we call them sacred encounters, where you listen to what does keep if I'm having a sacred encounter with you, we might ask things like, what is keeping you awake at night? Or what are the challenges before you? And so if people's own economic challenges come up, that might lead the way to engaging in building more livable community economically. So those are two thoughts about that, kind of looking at people's own lives and also looking at what the call to love neighbor means. Thank you. Yeah. The questions that have been asked are really important and beautiful questions, so I thank you for those. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's thank again Dr. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are now dismissed for lunch. Please be back here at 1:30. We will continue this conversation, in a sense, in a panel discussion about from charity toward justice, faith-based organizing for community change. So we'll continue on the same topic. Thank you.